All right, I think we're live. And mhm. Yeah, sure. I know it's a little dim, but yeah, hopefully you guys can see this really clearly. So we're gonna go over scope. First, we're gonna learn what it is, then the different types of scope, and then we're gonna learn about some little nuances of JavaScript that can trip people up initially. And so we'll go into that, and then we'll learn about the best practices. And like I've mentioned before, like if we take these into account when we're coding, then we should be able to avoid a whole class of errors that we may encounter. So scope is basically the variables that can be accessed by your code at a specific place in your code. So like code has a lot of different or three main different types of scopes. And so for us, if we're just coding in, a lot of us have, um, I would imagine, only coded in like a REPL or directly in code in these like sandboxes that are available to us. Some of you may have used like editors and things like that, where there's like a whole set of files. But usually, when you, um, let's say you're just coding in REPL and you just declare a variable like that, um, for our purposes, we can consider that like a global variable where every function can access this variable. Um, it's different in like Node and in the browser, but we can get into that later on. But here, obviously, like you declare your wow variable, and now everything below this pretty much can access this. That's basically what this means, like in terms of accessibility. And so we can console log wow, and then we see wow. It's pretty straightforward. And so again, I mentioned this global scope, and essentially, when you when you create a variable in the global scope, anything can have access to it at any point. So it makes it easy in a sense because wherever you need access to something, you can have it. You can just, console log it or, do any type of method on that variable at any place. So it may seem like really like a tempting place to like declare all your variables in a global scope, but often this can lead to some pitfalls that I'll get into later. But yeah, this is for our purposes. We can just imagine that this is a REPL, and we're just instantiating these variables, and now this is in the global scope, and we can access it with logs. Um, here, so what's when we first log wait for it, it's undefined because we'll talk about hoisting later on. But when you actually declare a variable like this part of the declaration gets hoisted to the top of the file. So it's almost like this part is ahead of this part. And so when we console log wait for it, it says undefined because we haven't defined it yet. The actual assignment happens in this line. So if this was line 2, 3, and 4, it's actually like this let wait for it goes to the top in line 1, and then we go log, and then it's undefined, and then we actually assign it here in line 3, and then in line 4 we can actually get the value of it. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but it's just a nuance. It's like a optimization that JavaScript does under the hood. Now this is functional scope. So this is what we're going to encounter lots of because we're going to be writing a lot of functions in this class and in the actual immersive program, and in your daily coding career you're going to be writing functions all the time. And what's awesome about functions in JavaScript is that variables that are declared inside of functions are locally scoped. And why this is so important, and it's important not to pollute the global scope, is that like basically if you set all your variables in a global scope, then that variable, like you can't use that again in some other way. Like that name is just pretty much already reserved for that one value. And so like if you had a variable that's really common, like let's say you had a variable like total and you just declared in the global scope, then you can't really but let's say there's a total for Johnny and there's a total for Billy and there's like many different totals and that's like the perfect name for it. But then if you've declared it in the global scope, then like it can only be one type of total. Like Johnny can't have his own total that's special to him, and David can't have his total, or like grade or something like some name. Like if you define in the global scope, like you can't. That's it. That's the only place it's defined, and so you can't use that name again, which is kind of annoying because we don't often naming things a descriptive name is really important in coding. And also, you might run into bugs where like you assign it like some function assigns a value to that global variable, and now like we don't know what the value is. Like we don't know which function changed that global variable. Like it's very complicated to know the actual value of that global variable and like which functions are changing it. And I'll give examples later on of how that might be, but it's really important in JavaScript and just organization wise to have your variables locally scoped like within functions so that there's no collisions and you can reuse that same name. Like if you have two functions and you use the variable grade in both of them, it's fine. They're different grades. Like they're local to its own space. So I know I'm talking a lot and like I should probably give an example here. So you guys, it's kind of weird. Like this thing is a little funky, but it's cut off. But essentially, this message, when you declare it inside the function, like this is always what you want to do here. You always want to declare your variables inside functions as much as you guys can, because let's say you had a sad function and then you just say let message inside the sad function, then it's fine. You're good. You can have two different variables with the same name because they're locally scoped within the function. But let's say you had this defined outside, then if you had a happy function and you used message, then your sad function can't use that same message, or it could, but it wouldn't be unique to that function anymore. It would just be like shared. And so you don't want that because now you got to use like a different name for it, like sad message or happy message. You can't just use message. So yeah, this is an example of something that's locally scoped. You can log it within the function and you have access to it inside this function, but once you're outside of it in the global scope, message is it doesn't have a value. So you actually get an error that message is not defined because you haven't even declared it. If you declared like let message out here and then you logged it, it would be undefined and it wouldn't like crash your program. But now you've crashed your program because there's not even a declaration like let message or something. So that's why you get this message is not defined error. But within the function, we're all good because that variable is scoped within that function. So that's called functional scope. And you can get really, this can be like, I've had interviews where people would ask questions, just like trivia type questions. It's more like rapid fire trivia or something. And they'll be like, oh, what is the value of this variable? And they'll nest like a bunch of functions and try to test like if you have a strong understanding of scope. And so while we go through these lectures and you guys see like functions that are defined within functions that are defined within other functions, there is a use case for that. And I'll also point out a practical, like non just interview, but like practical use case too. But this is a classic example of if there's a globally defined variable outside of the function, you can use the same variable within the function again because this one's in a different scope. And so that's really awesome that you can use the same variable unlimited times because that might be the perfect word to describe your variable. And so if you log here, what do you guys think this will output right here? Any takers? Yeah, think global, or yeah, it's act locally. And then what about um wait, I'm like I can't see the brackets. Okay, so this will be act locally. And then if you console logs message out here, what do you think it'll output? Yeah. So the first one is act locally, and if we were to log it outside, it would be act globally because you can't access variables that are within functions. You can't really go outside in, but you can go from inside out. And I'll explain that a little more later too. But here we have a little exercise where we have, let me just turn off Flux real quick actually, because I don't want this to get all weird. That didn't change much, but so if we have this function and then we log this, does anybody call this function? Does anybody know what would be output into the terminal? If you have a guess, you can just shout it out. It's fine if you're wrong. Yeah, it would be undefined is not a bad guess, but everything that's in the outer scopes, the inner functions have access to it. So whoever said think globally is right, because this inner function has access to this outer variable, but this outer scope doesn't have access to this. So if we try to console log message, like it would give you an error. It would give you like a reference error that message isn't even declared. But let's see. Yeah, it says think globally because again, outside in is fine, inside out, not fine. So parameters are also locally scoped. So what does this mean? This means that if you add a parameter, it's almost like the same thing as saying like let message equals message. But it just doesn't, we don't actually have to type that out, but under the hood, it's doing the same thing. So it's almost the same thing as the locally scoped thing that we were mentioning in the earlier slides where we were actually explicitly saying like let message equals, I love coding. But if you put an argument, if you give it a parameter, you can think of it interchangeably with saying let message or let whatever this parameter name is. So if this was A, it would be let A equals A. Like that's essentially what's happening here. So does anybody know what this would output if we called this function and pass it this parameter? This one's a little trickier. It's that's like about some of you got it right, some of you got it wrong, but I very much appreciate that you guys all shouted it out because it's fine to get it wrong. Honestly, we're all gonna make mistakes, but it would be act locally because inside a function, it first checks what's closest to it, like the actual scope that it's in. It first checks that before it scans out. So it first encounters this parameter that's passed in. It's essentially saying let message equals act locally. Let message equals message inside of here. And so message is going to be act locally. Now, if we didn't have any parameter, then it would be think globally because it looks inside its scope and it's like, oh, I can't find message. So let me keep going out into the higher and higher scopes. And it's like, oh yeah, I found this. So like, let me just log think globally. But in this particular case, it would be act locally because we go from inside out and whatever variable we encounter first is going to be what we log. So yeah.
Quick question.
Uh-huh.
If you, after that last line, uh,
Sorry, it's kind of laggy. I'm trying to go back, but
like if you recalled the same function without the message inside it,
uh-huh.
would it work?
Give me one sec. Sorry.
Like if you,
Let me just get to that slide real quick. Okay. So, what was that question again? Sorry, I was just trying to get back to the slide.
if you just did log a message below it with the opening and closing,
Like right here.
yeah. If you just did it without the string inside it, if you just said log a message.
Oh, without this.
Yeah, right below it. But you still had that one above it. Would it call the act locally because act locally was already inside that log a message and related to that function?
That's a good question. So you're saying this gets called,
Yeah.
and then after you call this same function and pass it,
Then don't pass anything.
and don't pass anything,
Yeah.
then it would first say act locally. That would be the first thing that's logged.
Okay.
And then the second one would be, it would, so like this would be undefined, so it would be undefined.
Yeah. So it's totally separate, even though you already
Yeah,
put in.
it's a separate, its own
value.
its own scope.
Okay.
So it'd be undefined because the reason why it wouldn't be an error is because message is gonna be if again like imagine that when you do this, when you pass it a parameter, it's saying let message equals message, and so you're saying if you don't pass it anything, then it's still declaring message. So if you at least declare the variable and try to log it, it won't break. It only breaks if you like console log a variable that you never even declared, but you don't have to give it a value just yet. So yeah, but that's a good question.
Just piggybacking on that, but if you didn't pass it anything, wouldn't it do things globally because it would then say it didn't see anything and then go outside to the next?
Well,
But the thing is, it's declared. Like,
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Different.
Basically, if it didn't even take in a if it didn't take in a variable, let's try it though, because
So is the fact that it's called message there kind of just like deceptive for the purpose of the slide?
yeah, it's like it's meant to trip you up, and there are like some companies that'll ask like questions like this where I have been asked like they'll give me a bunch of slides and I'm like, okay, like quick fire, instead of like most companies, which is like let me ask you like two like kind of hard algorithms problems. Other companies will be like, let me just test your JavaScript trivia knowledge. So I mean, knowing scope is just gonna be essential regardless. But these little like tricky things, like they can be like trivia questions. Let me just copy this just to make sure that I'm not going crazy. So yeah, we have act locally. And then if we just do log message and don't pass in a variable, it's undefined. Now, that's because it's doing let message equals message, and if you don't pass it anything, it's just undefined, and then it's logging that. But let's say we did this. Now, what would be logged? Yeah, because it looks within its scope and it says, is there a message variable? No, there isn't. There was if you did this. Because it's declaring it under the hood. It's just tricky because like you don't see it, but it's happening. That's great questions though, by the way. Really good. I think next time I just have to download these slides. It's because I believe I'm using them online, and so maybe that's why it's so slow. All right, so I believe this is a new slide. So here we have nested functions. So functions that are defined within functions. So like you guys might think like this is like pretty weird and like why would I ever do something like this? I'll give you a quick example after I go through this, but for now just bear with me. But there is actual use cases where you would define functions within functions, and it's not just like some tricky thing to like trip you guys up. So here we have our inner function, and as I said before, like outer functions don't have access to inner locally scoped variables, but the innermost function will have access to all the variables outside of it. So it works inside out. So it helps to kind of start. I would start looking at the innermost function. So we're calling this innermost function. So let's like start with here. And so we're setting inner var to be inner, and then we're logging global var, outer var, and inner var. So does anyone know what this would log right here? This global var? Yep. And then outer var? Yep. And then inner var? Yep. You have access to everything outside. So perfect. This would log global, outer, and inner. So this is where it'll get a little trickier. So here we have our outer function, and we're passing it a parameter called outer. And then we also have a function within it that's called inner, and we're calling that function. So does anybody have any idea what this would log? What would happen if we called this function? Like, what would it log? Any guesses? Like, again, if you're wrong, it's all good. Like, you have to be wrong in order to learn. So, yeah, perfect. It would be inner because although you go inside out, you also like, the first time you encounter this variable, that's when you log it. It'll keep going out if it doesn't find this. If this wasn't here, it would go in log global. But since it is defined within itself, then it'll just log the closest scoped variable. It'll just log it because it doesn't, it goes.
Does anything happen to the outer string that's in the bottom function? Like it just doesn't be used. It's not used. It kind of disappears.
You mean this?
The outer bottom. Like the string outer. Does that just go away? Because you're not using it.
Yeah. You're essentially not using it because it's in this scope.
So there's no real reason. I mean, this is an example to kind of test our knowledge.
Yeah. Again, it's like trivia type style where it's to test. Yeah, exactly. But you would never do this because it's pretty pointless. I mean, you might do this like accidentally or something, but yeah, this is just a test scope knowledge. So yeah, it would be inner. And again, I'll go over an example of why you would ever define a function within a function, like practically speaking. So we can get crazy with this, and that's kind of going to be the theme of today. But after today, hopefully we have a really solid grasp of these concepts. So in this case, are there any takers as to what this would log? Yes, it would be outer because you're passing it a parameter here. And then you're saying, this is basically saying let collision equals collision. So let collision equals outer. And then when you call this function, it's going to say, oh, is there a collision variable in my scope? No. There isn't. So let me go one more out. I found it. It could have gone here, but there was no need to because it found it in the intermediate scope. There is quite a lot of these actually. But this one is, are there any guesses as to this one? What this would log? Yep, global. Outer is a good guess, but because there's no parameter, there's no declaration. Like this is meaningless because it doesn't. You're not even declaring a variable by which you can access within this function. So this is like a useless parameter. It will still, it's not gonna break. It's still gonna call inner, and then inner is gonna log collision, look in scope, can't find it, outer scope can't find it, outer scope found it, log global. But you can't, if you don't declare a parameter, any parameter you pass in here is just lost. You won't be able to access it unless you use like args, but that's like for a different time. But for our purposes, like you can't access it. So yeah, the inner function can access the outer function scope, but it does not go the other way. So we're really gonna hammer this point home right now. So this is really complicated. I'm like staring at this right now. I'm like, it's a lot. But are there any guesses as to what's going on here and what we would log if we called this function? So once we call this function, first thing that happens is this gets set. Outer var is outer, and then we call inner. And so inner var is inner. So when we call outer var and inner var, what do you think is going to be logged? What would outer var log? And then inner var. Okay, so but we're not done yet. We're going down. So we logged outer and inner, and then what about here when we log inner var from within the scope of the outer function? Like what would this log? I believe it would throw an error because this isn't even defined anywhere. Yeah, I can't see its definition, so that's close though. But I think it would just throw an error and crash the program because we never even declared this. We declared it in here, but the outer function doesn't know the inner function's declaration. So I believe it'll throw an error, but yeah, outer inner var is not defined. Like it would be awesome if it just logged undefined and just kept going, but unfortunately stuff like this, like it's a little more of a serious error where it can't find that variable. Yeah, the inner function still looks for a local declaration before looking at the next level. So in this case, I believe it will just log inner and outer and inner, and then it's fine. Like there's no errors here because the outside scope isn't trying to access an inner scope. And when you don't have that, everything runs smoothly. Oh, it's undefined. Oh, because it has a parameter, yeah. So like it's easy to get tripped up. Like this is here. So again, when we have this as a parameter, it'll say let outer var equals outer var. And since it's actually declared, it'll try to log that version instead of this version. So it's like a little trick, and you know I've been duped, but it's undefined. And are there any questions as to why it's undefined? It's under the hood parameters declare that parameter variable under the hood. That's always happening. All right, so let's go over a quick example of why you might want to even define a function within a function. So say you have a function and say you have like an array. We'll go over arrays later, but for now, let's just say like days of the week. You guys might have seen this before, this data structure. We're going to go over it soon. And this data structure is a lot of fun. It's used pretty frequently. I'm gonna make this a little bigger for you guys. And let's say like you have return like index or something, and then return days of the week at index. So like this is like a normal way you might create this function. So you might just call return day at 0, and then it would give you Monday. Or I would have to log this. But what's happening here is that every time I call this function, I'm reinstantiating the array. So it's kind of like not fully optimal. Because like every time I want to call this again, return day 1, I'm like creating this, I'm calling this function, so I'm creating this again and again and again. Do I really need to create this like again and again and again? So if you were to create a function within a function, I'm try to figure this out here. Return function index. It's like, let me try to think about this real quick. So we're returning the array, we're returning the function. Yeah, so this way we only create that array once. Because let's say like this is a little bit contrived, but there are times where this could be useful. So I probably don't even need this. Scope, this has access to this. Damn. Return days of the week. Days of the week is not a function. Oh. This is an array, so I just try to call it, but yeah, so here when we call this function, now like if we, let's see, let me just do this actually. So now like if we did this, we only create this once, and we're just using this. If you guys can kind of, I just wanted to show you guys a practical example, and we're not just like defining functions within functions for no reason. Like this actually happens in like real code. I mean real situations, because now I return this function, and so now I have this function. But this function always has access to the outer scope because it goes outside in. I mean, inside out. So we're not constantly creating this over and over again, because we're not constant. If we were to call this function return day over and over, then yeah, we would be creating this over and over and like repeating work essentially. But I've returned my function that has access to this, and so now I can just call it the function that's returned, and I'm not creating this with each subsequent function call. Does that kind of make sense to people? How this isn't being created each time. So yeah, there are times where we'll want to return a function from a function. And also, for example, like, whoa, okay. Another example would be like we don't want to, as I mentioned before, we don't want to pollute the global scope. We want to, so like, let's say we return, and this is going to be another thing we'll learn later on, but get day index. Index set day. Let's see. So now, I have a function that returns an object that has functions as parameters. And like this is the same idea. Like it's a little more practical though, because now like this variable is locally scoped within this function. And now I have like two different functions that can like get the day or set the day and all work off of this locally scoped variable. If otherwise, like we would have no way to, if we didn't return a function from within a function or define functions within functions, then functionalities like this wouldn't be possible. Because you would essentially have to pollute the global scope. Like you could define this in the global scope and then define functions that act on that global scope. But again, we don't want to do that in our code. We don't want to define, like, for example, like we could have this array outside, and then we could just define these two functions also in the global scope. But what you'll find is like now I can't use this days of the week variable. I've like polluted my global scope with that variable. And so we want to keep things local. And so the only way to do that is define a function within a function, because the function gives you a whole new playground inside of it that the outside does not know about and does not care about and isn't polluted by, isn't affected by. So it's like a little contained space. And so functions within functions you do encounter frequently. So yeah, I just wanted to do a quick sidebar on that because I know some of you guys might have been wondering, like, are we ever gonna do this stuff? And like, yeah. So now we'll go and get into block scope, and this is a little less confusing in my opinion. But yeah, it's the same idea, except this thing's really annoying. But basically, if you have squiggly braces, it's the same thing as, you can think of it as creating its own scope. So inside this if statement, if we declare anything, then if we had an else inside that, we don't have access to block. If you want access to block, you have to put this outside of the if. So yeah, this will log Jenny from the block. Oh wait, it'll log Jenny from the block. Oh, but then the outside log, this log, it won't be defined because this is a local scope. The squiggly brackets creates a local scope. So some of you guys might be wondering, like, var, the difference between var and let and const. There's a couple differences, but a main difference is that in var, it doesn't care about, if you use var, it doesn't care about block scope. It'll just go into the outer scope, so it'll leak out. So in this case, it'll log Jenny from the block, and then Jenny from the, because if you use var, it would be almost like this is out here. it's advised that we never use var, um, but unfortunately, there's a lot of code bases that exist that have been built before this beautiful addition of let and const, and so it's going to be something that we encounter by maintaining existing code bases and legacy systems that might have a bunch of vars, um, in their code. So it helps to know some pre-ES6 features. But whenever we write new code, I would say we avoid var because there's some leakiness to the var keyword. Yeah. All right, so are there any questions on block scope? If not, then we will continue onwards to functions and hoisting. So this is like some little nuance of JavaScript as a language where essentially all function keywords, like they're like dragged up to the top of the file. So it doesn't matter where you declare your function. This will always work. So they're defined within the function keyword. They can be run on any line. It doesn't matter. Like you don't have to define this over here and then call this. Like it'll just be pulled to the top. JavaScript does this for some internal optimizations that I'm not aware of why, but it just happens. And so it's nice that for stuff like this, like you don't really have to keep in mind order, but for other cases, you do have to keep in mind order. Yeah.
Does that only work if you're doing it, if you're defining a function that way?
Yeah.
Not if you did like the const. and
Yeah.
the function name?
Then it wouldn't work. That's just what I'm about to get to now, which is a perfect segue. But yeah, when you define them like that, then the const. So if this was const will this work equals, and then like that. Then you don't even need to say it's a function. You just put a squiggly parentheses. If you're gonna do that, then the const will this work will be hoisted, but not the actual assignment of that variable to this function. So it'll be like you won't be able to call it. It'll be like trying to invoke a undefined variable. So that's a very good question though. So that might be what trips people up is like, oh, like functions, I can just define them wherever and they'll work wherever in the file, but actually it's only if you use the function keyword. So that will work. However, this is the same exact, this is just what you had mentioned. So I think it's a great question, that this will not work because although this will be declared above this, so if we console logged will this work, it would just be undefined. It wouldn't give you an error, like it wasn't even declared, but it would just be undefined. But variable assignments happen at that line that it's actually assigned.
What if you declare a function in a function, and you try to call it outside of the global scope?
Maybe I can run an example of that
Like
because
you try and call the inner function from a global scope function call. You know what I mean?
So like, let me try to do an example. So like, you're saying I define a function that's outer, and then you're saying I define another function in here?
Yeah, and then you try to access that inside function from a global scope with the function call without accessing the outside.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think so, because I think this function, this inner function will be locally scoped to this. So like, but that's a great question though. I don't think you can do this. Yeah, it'll say inner is not defined because you can't go outside in. Yeah, but that's a good question because who knows? Maybe it is hoisted to the outer scope levels, but it's only like in terms of like the line within that scope. It's not gonna hoist to the outer scope. Yeah, it's like within its own lane. Like not, it won't go into new lanes. But yeah, that's a great question because, to be honest, like I wasn't 100% sure, but I had an inkling. We're almost through, guys, this lecture. So yeah, we're going over hoisting.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Which of the like hoisting rules will a fat arrow function follow? Because it's
So let me just go over this real quick because I don't want to keep going back and forth with the lecture because it kind of loads up. So let me just finish this up and then I'll answer that question before we start the workshops. But some best practices are you should not change globally scoped variables. And I mentioned this a little bit before, but like in this function, you could reset this because you have access to this. So always true is this outer one because there's no local always true. So it has access to this and you can do whatever you want to. You can reset it. But then now, like, if something else accesses this, then it will be. Is there any guess as to what the value would be if some other function accessed this variable after calling it? It would be false because after you called this, you reset this. In here, you're reassigning this to false. So
even though it's inside a function.
But yeah, but this isn't declared within a function. It's accessing the outer one. So it's not like a new version. Like if we did let always true equals false, then this will stay true. But since we don't have that declaration, this inner function will access the outer scope. And so this is why using global is dangerous because like usually if you define a global variable, it'll never, you are basically saying like this is a value that will never change. Like you'll say const pi equals 3.14. Like you will never say like something that's stateful, you should never declare as a global variable because something might change it and now you're looking at the code base and you're like, you see like const pi equals 3.14. So obviously it's 3.14, right? So you're gonna go about your day coding everything using that as if it's 3.14, but somewhere else, some other function changed that global variable to 1.69, and then now, like now your assumption is false, and there's gonna be bugs everywhere, like in your code. So that's why we try to avoid globals in the first place. But if we have to use globals, then we always make sure it's some value that will never change, like const seasons equals an array of summer, winter, and in that way, everything else can access that as if that's a source of truth that is immutable. But this is something that you never want to do, but the thing is, like, we can't enforce that. So that's why we just try not to use globals, period, because although we tell everyone don't do this, like someone can do this. There's nothing stopping them from doing this. So just try to avoid globals, period. But there are times where you're gonna have to use them. Yeah, so this will, does anyone know what will log here in this case? All is well. But then we called this function, it reassigned this. Yeah, it would go into the error because we're calling this function and this is reassigning the global. We're doing exactly what shouldn't be done. And so it'll throw you the error. If we set this as if we set this as a local variable, then everything would be perfect and we would be going about our day along the flower beds and everything will be fine. This is okay. This is what you always want to do. Local variables, don't mess with the global variables if there are any. Try not to even use global variables. But I think this will apply more like when you're actually building apps, when you're actually like working with the browser and stuff like that. Like right now, like when you're in an isolated sandbox, like it's not that big of a deal. When you're just trying to solve the problems at hand. So yeah, avoid cluttering the global namespace. Again, if we define a global variable, that is the one time we can use that variable. And if we ever want to use that variable again, we can't. Always safer to declare variables in functions or blocks so you don't accidentally overwrite variables and confuse other people that are working on the same code base as you. None of these problems really exist if you're the only one working on an app, but once you start collaborating with like 20, 30 people on the same code base, things can get messy if you don't follow like some guidelines. And so yeah, this is the recap. That's pretty much the end of this lecture, and I'll get to your question about fat arrow functions. So was your question that fat arrow functions, like if they get hoisted or not?
Yeah.
So this is like some ES6 syntax where technically this is a function. So because this is using a variable declaration, I believe it's the same as a normal variable declaration where the declaration gets hoisted, but not the assignment. So I believe like if you were to, I believe this would be undefined. Fat arrow is not defined. And so you couldn't call it because, yeah. So it's the declaration is hoisted, but not the assignment. Good question though. So yeah, that pretty much wraps us up for the lecture. So everyone can wake up. And we'll start the pairing and the exercises. Again, it may look like this is a lot of trivia type stuff,